Essay: The importance of responses to changes in the internal and external environment of an organism. Homeostasis is the control of the internal environment such that changes to the internal environment are modified to ensure the norm or set point are retained. For example, beta cells of the islets of Langerhans are able to detect changes in the levels of blood glucose. When the levels of blood glucose rise, for example just after a meal, then the beta cells are stimulated and this leads to the release of insulin. The insulin release travels in the blood to target cells in the liver and the muscle cells. This causes the expression of genes involved in the expression of channel proteins for glucose, called GLUT4. The insertion of these proteins into the cell surface membrane of the liver or muscle cells causes more glucose to be taken into the cells and thus lowers the blood glucose levels back to normal. The importance of maintaining the blood glucose levels is seen in the effects of high long-term glucose levels in diabetics, for example kidney damage and damage to the optic nerve. Too high levels of glucose can lead to coma and death. Similarly, low levels of glucose in the blood are detected by the alpha cells of the islets of Langerhans, and these cells release glucagon. The glucagon binds to receptors on liver cells and causes the release of glucose from the cells following the expression of proteins involved in hydrolysis of glycogen into glucose and the synthesis of glucose from non-carbohydrate sources, which is called gluconeogenesis. This is important since the levels of glucose in the blood are needed for respiration by the cells in order to stay alive. If the blood glucose levels drop too low, then coma can be induced and death may follow. Levels of glucose in cells is also important for the glucose has an effect on water potential. This is why when glucose is converted into glycogen for storage. The regulation of blood water potential is also important for the maintenance of cells in the normal state and able to function and carry out metabolic reactions efficiently. Osmoreceptors in the hypothalamus are able to detect low water potential in the blood. This causes the cells to shrink and send nervous impulses to the posterior pituitary. At the posterior pituitary, the cells release ADH, antidiuretic hormone, which is also known as vasopressin. This hormone travels in the blood to the cells of the collecting duct in the kidney nephron. Here, when the ADH binds to the receptors on the cell surface membrane, it triggers a second messenger that leads to the expression of genes coding for aquaporin proteins. These proteins are inserted into the cell surface membrane of the collecting duct cells on the side facing into the tubule. This allows more water to be taken into the collecting ducts by osmosis. This creates a highly concentrated urine, but as the water is returned to the blood, it ensures that the water potential is returned to the normal set point. In the blood, water is transported as part of the plasma fluid, but oxygen is transported by hemoglobin. The tissues that the blood travels to have a low partial pressure of oxygen, and this causes the hemoglobin to unload its oxygen content to the tissues so that the cells are able to respire aerobically and generate ATP for active processes such as gene expression, which requires ATP for the attachment of the correct amino acid to tRNA molecules. If the oxygen levels in the blood are low, then the hemoglobin unloads. If the oxygen levels in the tissues are high, then the hemoglobin picks up more oxygen molecules. And this typically happens at the lungs, where the partial pressure of oxygen is usually high. In a fetus, the hemoglobin has a high affinity for oxygen. This is because the hemoglobin is made from different subunits of polypeptide, which causes the hemoglobin molecules to have a higher affinity for oxygen. When the baby is born, the fetal hemoglobin is no longer required, since the partial pressure of oxygen available is much higher in the lungs, where gas exchange takes place, as compared to the placenta, where gas exchange took place when the hemoglobin was in the blood of the fetus. This change in the external environment, and hence the internal environment, led to a change in the expression of genes coding for hemoglobin, to cause the hemoglobin type produced to have a lower affinity for oxygen. This allows more oxygen to be delivered to the tissues of the newborn baby, which is necessary since the cells of the newborn baby are dividing rapidly by mitosis to enable growth of the organism, and all of this requires ATP from aerobic respiration, which requires lots of oxygen, which would only be delivered if the hemoglobin ended up having a lower affinity for oxygen and thus delivering more oxygen to the tissues more quickly. As a newborn baby, a number of reflexes are needed in order to survive, and these are examples of protective, simple reflexes that ensure survival of the organism, by protection of the organs and tissues from damage themselves. A newborn baby will move their face towards a finger that strokes them on the cheek. This is an example of a reflex needed for the baby to find the mother's breast to take milk. Babies will grasp and hold tightly to the mother's skin or fingers, especially if startled. In geese, once hatched, the baby geese will imprint on the first thing, usually their mother, and follow it around. Insects have reflexes such as the turn reflex in woodlice. If forced to turn left, the next turn will always be the opposite direction, in this case a right turn. This enables the woodlice to demonstrate a zigzag pattern in their movement, which is more difficult for predators to follow and ensures that the woodlouse is moving away from the source of threat, such as dry or light conditions, rather than moving round in a circle. Woodlice also show taxis, which are also behaviours in response to changes in external environment. In the case of a taxis, they may move towards darkness and damp areas and move away from lighter or drier areas. In addition, maggots show kinetic behaviour, in which they will move more and more faster when they are placed in dry conditions and move more slowly when placed in dark, moist conditions. This ensures that they are more likely to get out of the conditions that they do not favour them for their survival and into the conditions where they do favour the survival. Some plants show thigmotropic behaviour. This is where they move towards supporting materials. For example, tendrils found on climbing plants are able to wrap around solid objects, canes or wires, hence the thigmotropic behaviour. For example, in pea plants, the tendrils grow, and as they grow, they wrap around anything that is solid. This helps gain support for the plant so that leaves can receive more light and the plant will not collapse under its own weight. So this makes it more likely the plant will have a successful production of peas and more likely survive and pass on favourable alleles to the next generation of pea plants. In humans, it is possible to respond to touch using Pacinian corpuscles, which are an example of a specially adapted receptor able to detect changes in pressure in the skin as a result of changes in the environment outside. The activation of the Pacinian corpuscle leads to the generation of a generator potential, which in turn leads to the activation of an action potential in a neuron. These action potentials are relayed to the spinal cord and brain, and this allows the body to think about its actions and respond. It may be if the pressure is too much and pain is evoked that the person moves the limb where the pain was detected, and this is important to protect limbs from permanent tissue damage by the stimulus that activated the Pacinian corpuscle. In times where receptors detect threat, for example, if eyes perceive a predator on the horizon, then activation of fight or flight mechanisms and the sympathetic nervous system are necessary. The sympathetic nervous system can send electrical impulses to adrenal glands and cause the release of adrenaline into the blood. The release of adrenaline then causes the heart rate to increase, since when adrenaline binds to receptors on the sinoatrial node in the heart, it causes an increase in the number of electrical impulses reaching the atria and the atrioventricular node. This increase in the heart rate is important for fight or flight, as it will mean that more carbon dioxide will be blown off at the lungs and more oxygen can be delivered to the aerobically respiring tissues such as the muscle cells, which need oxygen for aerobic respiration and generation of ATP for muscle contraction for movement. The individual is then able to run away from the predator and is more likely to survive and pass on the advantageous alleles to the next generation. In addition, adrenaline can also affect the liver cells, causing glycogenolysis, and cause the increased release of glucose from the cells storing the glycogen, and this will increase the glucose levels in the blood and lead to more aerobic respiration by the cells of the body by delivering more glucose more quickly to each cell.